Hello and welcome to episode 303 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are we doing?
I'm good. It's been great to be back, feet under the desk in the new year, and to really kick on, because there's such a cyclical nature to money, which people probably don't realise who listen to this podcast, that if you look at the traffic to the site or listens to the podcast, January is always the new year, new money, new me theme that we talked about on last week's podcast. So we really see that in evidence, and we have record levels of traffic pretty much every day. And so it's really getting back to work, giving people what they want and all that kind of stuff, and get the team motivated and writing. So it's actually quite exciting coming back to Money to the Masses in the new year. So I'm quite buzzing, because it is the point where the public are also interested in money. So it's not just us pushing stuff out, people are looking for it at the same time. So that's been good. And the other thing is, this week I've been carrying on with a task that I might turn into a podcast in the future. I had mentioned it before about the idea of a black book, as it were, for your own finances. So really pulling together everything in your finances in a slightly morbid way. I mean, I don't mind saying it, but we talk about wills, people don't want to talk about having a will and if they're going to die and all that kind of thing. I've been doing a lot of stuff at home about pulling together bits and pieces of our finances at home, because like most households, there are people like my wife and I will do different parts of our finances. And also, as you'd expect, I obviously do most of the financial stuff because it's really my job. So what I've done is we're putting together almost a black book of everything that goes on. So if I got hit by a bus, or unfortunately if my wife got hit by a bus, then we could pick that up and actually know everything that's going on, down to the smallest direct debit that's going out of our account, to actually explain what's going on. And do you know what? That is quite a task. I've been doing this for probably about 5 hours now. And so it's something that I think if the worst was to happen, it'd be wonderful that people who are left behind could actually just pick this thing up and, or whether it's online, whatever way you want to do it, and suddenly see, yep, these are all the accounts, investments, insurances. This is what should happen if I was to die. These things should pay out, or keep an eye on these bills. This is where our electricity bill is at the moment, blah, blah, blah. All the nuances that you're going to have to take care of. And I've kind of digressed really away from what the podcast is going to be about, but it's an important task, and maybe I'll come back to it in the future and tell people what sort of stuff I've put in there. I mean, we've touched upon something before in the podcast very briefly, but having sat down and done it, Andy, I'm just amazed about how much nuance there is in your finances, and that if you want to tell somebody else what those nuances are, it takes a lot of time.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I've also been having those conversations with my wife over the Christmas period. We've had a couple of weeks where we've kind of taken stock, sat back, we just discuss things, and eventually everything comes round to money, especially at Christmas time. And we've kind of had those morbid conversations, the what ifs, and my wife is maybe like yours, Damien. I take over the money matters, fairly unaware of what's going on in terms of the finances in our position. So we'd love to have a black book, like you say, and it's where do you start? And so it sounds like you're well underway. And do you know what? I bet there's hundreds of listeners shouting into their headphones right now saying, I do that too, or I've had that conversation. And I bet we've all got different solutions. So there's definitely something in there.
Do you know what it is, Andy? It's the equivalent of, when you break down on the motorway, or you've got a flat tyre, knowing where the spare wheel is on your car, or the jack, or the locking wheel nuts, the key for
or
that.
Or the number for the RAC.
RAC, all those things. It's just that you never think about the problem until it arrives. And of course, we go through life expecting everything's going to be normal. And I've just had a period, I suppose, where we had a period over the last few weeks where I had a bit of time off, and we were talking about this kind of stuff, and just thought, well, do you know what? Why don't we have this for our own lives, in terms of the worst could happen, that you actually know what to do in those given scenarios? Who do you ring? Who would I ring up? Or do you mean the things that my wife looks after? Well, how do I know what they are, what needs to be done? And so it does feel like a big job, but at the same time, there's something quite therapeutic about it, because I know I've gone, like I say, I've gone aside from what's going to be on the podcast. What you start to pick up are the loose ends. For example, a life insurance policy that you might have put in place that you haven't got round to putting in trust. Those kind of things, you start realising, I haven't done that. And of course, because I have been doing it, looking up policy numbers, telephone numbers and things like that, you suddenly get all the information together that you can actually just make that call while you're perhaps working, just in the background on the phone, in your earpiece while you're sitting in the queue, and then you can just make that phone call to check certain things. So anyway, digressed. Black book, I think it's a great thing. Maybe we'll do a podcast on it in the future if people are interested. So anyway, on the podcast this week, the usual three pieces, but I've taken a bit of a probably psychological spin on things, actually. Again, it kind of links to what I've just been talking about, but sitting back and looking at things and mindsets and about New Year and everything like that, and about looking forward. So one of the things I want to talk about is investing. I want to talk about one of the biases that exist that I've never talked about before, and actually I've only just come to light actually through some research about when you were born matters. So the year that you were born in has a material impact on your ability to grow wealth going forward. So I want to talk about that. The other thing I want to talk about is something that's been inspired by lockdown, homeschooling, all the things that are driving us crazy, which is to do with working out what is enough, what that means for you. So that's something I would explain in more detail. And the other thing I want to talk about is good enough is good enough. The idea of reasonable versus rational when it comes to managing your money.
Okay, so shall we start with the investing piece? We do that most weeks anyway. So this is a piece about when you're born matters. I'm all ears. I've not heard of this concept.
So before on this podcast, we've talked about biases that exist, and they can be things like recency bias, where we put more weight on things that have happened recently versus things that happened in the past, things like anchoring. If you go back to podcast 185, I did a whole piece on how to avoid behavioral biases. So these are the biases that you might not realize that would have a big impact on managing your money and make you poorer at it. I mean, one of them obviously is confirmation bias. It comes up every now and then where you find yourself looking for things that will confirm prior beliefs. So if you think the market's about to collapse, you'll inevitably find articles or go looking for them about reasons why the stock market is about to collapse. On the flip side, if you're somebody who thinks it's going to the moon and the market's only going higher, then you will be looking for reasons why the market is going to go higher, and you dismiss anything that says the opposite to what you believe. So go and listen to that podcast because it's interesting about the biases that are out there and you want to try and avoid them. But there are other biases that you might not realize that are linked to effectively when you were born, and they can have a huge impact on your ability to create wealth and be successful at investing. Now, what I'm talking about is something that is really the cousin of something called sequence of returns risk. So if you invest, so if you think about money compounding, then over time it compounds. The rate of return you get in a given year, say you got 7% in one year, 5% in the next year, the different returns in each year, the order doesn't necessarily matter because it's just like you multiply a bunch of numbers together, you'll get the same answer if you multiply them in a different order. But that obviously breaks down where there's a different weighting of money. So to give you a very quick example, if you get to retirement and you've got a pot of money and you withdraw a significant sum at the point that the market plummets, then that is a bigger percentage of the money of your pot as the market's tumbled, and therefore your pot won't be able to recover as quickly. So it will have a real big detrimental impact to your wealth in retirement. If, on the other hand, the market had rallied strongly and you'd taken money out and then the market had fallen after that, then your wealth would be preserved in a way. That makes sense? Because if you have a big hit early on and you take out a fixed lump sum, then when the market rebounds, then you are going to be worse off. So let's just say the market falls 20% one year, rallies 10% the next. If your 20% is the first year and the 10% rally is later, then that will have a detrimental impact, or more of a detrimental impact than if you'd had a rally of 10% in the first year and then a fall of 20% later. So that's very quickly a rough and ready explanation of the sequence of returns risk. Now, I can come back to that in the future and how you mitigate that, because it's quite an interesting topic in its own right. But what it means is that there is a psychological impact of this. It's like the cousin of what I was just describing. So if you were born in a year that perhaps you were born into an economy that was booming and the stock market was doing well at the point that you became an adult. So it's not always the year that you're born, it's when you become an adult, particularly, and you start taking an interest in investing, then that will have a big impact on not only your view on investing, but also on how you will invest later in life. So if at the point at which you reach adulthood, so that's when most people might start investing, so in their 20s and 30s, you happen to hit the biggest bull market ever, then the growth in your money will mean you will start to believe that investing in stocks is the best thing ever. If, on the other hand, when you come to invest, or when you reach adulthood, you happen, because of the year you were born, to be in an era where the stock markets are collapsing, then you might get to the point of, say, like you start investing in your early 20s. By the time you're in your mid 30s, you've actually got less money than you had than when you started. Your view on investing in stocks is going to be very negative. So what will happen, and there's been evidence to show this in studies, that later in life, as you go forward, your view of what is a good investment and a bad investment and your asset mix will be determined by your own experiences, because we each paint a picture of the world based on an experience that we have. That's the bias, that's the tendency. And we also tend to project what's happened in the past into the future, despite the fact that the future doesn't necessarily have to look anything like the past. So there was some research that was done, and it was there's a website called kitches.com, which is only like a blog of some financial firm in America, but it was quite interesting. They did a chart that showed the experiences of different generations, and they looked at baby boomers, they looked at Generation Xers, as they're called, and millennials. I hate all those terms, but just for people to be able to put themselves in a bracket, what they did is they defined each generation but split them in two. So they did the early baby boomers, so they were reaching adulthood, so that was in the early 20s when they started investing, between 1972 and 81. The late boomers, it would be 1982 to 91. Then the early Generation Xers, as they're called, they would be reaching adulthood between 1991 and 2000. Then the late Generation Xers would be 99 to 2008. The early millennials would be reaching adulthood 2007 to 2016. And the late millennials will be reaching adulthood around now, basically 2015 onwards. And what they did is they looked at the stock market in America and looked at each of those different categories of people, how much growth they would have experienced in the first 10 years of their adulthood versus the other generations. And what they found is that the late baby boomers would have had, say, $1 would have grown to around about $5 in those 10 years. Whereas for a late Generation Xer, so someone who reached adulthood between 1999 and 2008. So really, Andy, we're not quite that good. We're probably just a little bit before, but people who are reaching adulthood around the turn of the millennium, they basically would have ended up with the same dollar. They wouldn't have had any growth on their investments. And that's because if you think about what happened after the dot-com bubble, it burst, didn't it? And then we had the financial crisis. So the stock market basically plummeted, rebounded and plummeted again. So it went nowhere in that period, in that decade. Whereas those baby boomers, when they got into investing in the 1970s, they had a very good 10 years of the stock market. So what it means is those people would be thinking investing in the stock market is a good idea, where somebody who perhaps had been attaining adulthood around the turn of the century are nervous about the stock market because of the dot-com crash. And so therefore they are going to be less inclined to invest in stocks going forward than somebody who had a good experience when they hit adulthood. But as I mentioned, they split the categories even between each generation. So interestingly, if you were a late Generation Xer, so somebody who reached adulthood really between 1999 and 2008, they, like I say, had made no money. But somebody who had reached adulthood at the beginning of the 90s, so they really are still in the same generation, they had made as much money as the baby boomers in their first 10 years of investing, because they were investing during the 90s and the rally of the equity market, and they captured all of that surge in the dot-com bubble. So therefore, even people in the same generation, not born very far apart, have very differing views of the stock market and whether it's worth investing. And actually, if you take it one step further, it's not just about whether they would invest in stocks, it's about which assets they would invest in. So I did some numbers and I was sort of digging around. Now, if you look at the UK property prices, so you can go on the Land Registry site and you can find an index that shows you the average house price in the UK, and you can go back and look at it over time. And I went back and looked at it at 1999. So in June 99, the average house price was £75,995. Fast forward 10 years, then the average house price in 2009 was £159,651. So basically, it had doubled. So if somebody had attained adulthood around the turn of the century and had bought a house, then by the time they got to their 30s, that house price would have doubled. On the flip side, if they'd invested in the FTSE 100, their money would have fallen around about 30% because we had the dot-com crash and then we had the financial crisis. So you can see why people who are of that generation, who basically around our age, Andy, and upwards, have an obsession with property because their first early experience of investing or of growing wealth in any way, don't forget that lots of people won't have had access to investing in the same way as you do today because the robo-advice firms and platforms of this world didn't exist. So they couldn't really have as much experience of investing in stocks, for example, than they did in property. But in any event, the experience of growing wealth, the quickest way they saw it happen, the best way they saw it happen in their view, was via the property market. So that's why, or one of the reasons why people become obsessed with property and say that's the best thing to do. They don't realise that they've got a bias that is inherent in them based upon when they were born. And it also explains why you hear about Robinhood investors, so the people in America who invest in stocks commission free, all these sort of young people that they class them as these millennials crazily betting money on the stock market. Well, you've got to realise that when they've attained adulthood, it's been in a period where there's been huge amounts of quantitative easing. We saw the famous examples in America where we had David Portney. Now, if you don't know who he is, he's just quite an abrasive character who is well known in sports betting, but just took during the lockdown to betting on the stock market, basically buying stocks and just buying all the unloved stocks and really making a mockery of Wall Street by making lots of money by saying stocks can only go up. It's almost comical if it wasn't a little bit worrying at times that people would follow his advice. But the point is, since the crash and the pandemic, he's right, because all the money that's been pumped into markets is something that has caused stock markets to keep going up. So that's why millennials, and I don't like to use the term and class people, but people who attained adulthood or have got into investing in recent years will think that stocks can only go up. So they will always have a bias towards that. It depends what happens. If the market then crashes and they lose lots of money, then they might have a slightly different view. But the point is that when you look at it, how you invest going forward is going to be influenced by your bias based upon your first-hand experiences. So what I want people to do is challenge that. So they've got to realise that when you go and ask for investment advice or people's opinion on what to do with your money, think about, when you look at them, when were they born? And if they're of a certain age, you can probably guess what they're going to say. And it's because the experiences they've had from either the assets they could invest in, but actually maybe the ones that they did invest in and enjoyed the best growth will influence what they say. It's why property is always the most popular answer, probably in the UK. So bear that in mind, and therefore don't take somebody else's view, because you are actually taking on board their biases and they don't even realise they've got them. So if you're going to listen to somebody, bear that in mind. Scrutinise your own biases, be aware of them, and I think it's why you've got to be objective when you invest any money. You've got to look at it and start from an objective place. Look at the historic numbers. If you are going to start looking at how investments have performed, look at a range of investments. Don't go down the confirmation bias route that I mentioned earlier, only looking at things that you think are good and seeing things that you want to see. Be objective, challenge your own thinking, and also diversify your portfolio, because then that stops you having to form these certain biases. The other thing is, be very deliberate about what you're going to do. Look and analyze what it is you're going to invest in, why you're going to do it. And I actually think that it also reaffirms the reason why investing for your children can be a good idea. Because if you invest for your children and they then get to attain adulthood and they've got a pot, a bit like the Millionaire episode that I mentioned before and was very popular, the podcast that we did on becoming a millionaire, then they will have seen success in whatever you did at that point, and they will have experience already at adulthood that won't be reliant on what just happens in the next 5 to 10 years. They've actually got a longer time span to look at, because they've got the experience of what happened to their portfolios they didn't even know they had up to the point of adulthood, and then what happens next. And it gives them a broader range of experience when they go forward, and probably increases their chances of being successful investors. So there you go. Bear in mind your own biases and try to mitigate them.
Okay, good stuff. Moving on to the next piece on the podcast now, and it's kind of quite timely, I suppose. I suppose that's not by accident, Damien. This is a piece that's going to help a lot of people going into lockdown, homeschooling.
Well, it was inspired by it. That's what really happened. I mean, we've been talking off the podcast, weren't we, Andy, before we came on, about homeschooling and the difficulties of it and how trying to work and juggle all these things at once. And it is, everybody knows we're now in a national lockdown. And we've been here before. We were here a year ago, and it's difficult. So people are having to get used to that idea. Homeschooling is difficult. So these things are going around in my head. The fact it's a new year, new money, new me. The sort of, you start to look at what you want from the year, trying to be positive, partly because 2020 was so dreadful. And actually, while I was doing some of the work with my daughter, she had to do a piece on something called the Magic Box. It was a poem that was written by Kit Wright. And effectively, this magic box was filled with magical moments and experiences and fantastic events. It's a poem that's quite, I think, well known in schools, and they do work around it. And one of the things that my daughter had to do, and she struggled a bit at first, but she had to come up with ideas of what she would put in a magical box. And it was the idea of what would she put in that she really loved, things that were special. And so I helped her sort of think about those things. What are they? It could be something like feel of sand between your toes, all that kind of stuff on a beach, and trying to think what is magical in experiences. Take all of that and wrap it all up. And it kind of inspired me to start thinking about lockdown and the life lessons. Go back to podcast 270. There's a bit of homework for everybody. And listen to podcast 270, which covered the lockdown life lessons that we had learned from the first lockdown. And it's I've listened to it again today, and it's an episode that's got a lot of insight, and it talks about building a cash buffer and the importance of it. 2020 was the year where everybody learnt the importance of it. And usually 3 to 6 months of perhaps expenses or wages, whichever definition you want to use, is what people say is best, possibly up to 12 months now. And I was talking about on that podcast the insight it gave to FI, so the financial independence movement, and frugality, and basically how we all learn how we could live frugally. We all learn how to live without certain things, and we all learn to have to cut back because of the pressures of the pandemic on our own money and the economy. We had to look at things like insurances, all that kind of stuff. So the lessons that came from that. But as I was pondering these things, it suddenly made me realise that actually the crisis that we're back in now, again, we shouldn't let it go to waste. We should try and learn from it and influence our thinking. And in a way, help us to explore the whole financial independence mindset a little more. And so where I want to start this thought process is like the cash buffer I mentioned. So we want to try and build cash buffers. We're in a pandemic. You want to try and shore up your finances. And it can take a long time, but there are ways that you can speed up that process. That could be that you cut down your expenses to a sufficient level that actually you don't need as much as you thought you needed. That buffer doesn't have to be as big because you're focusing on expenses rather than how many months' wages that you need. So that is one of the things you can do to speed up that process. And of course, if you have access to lines of credit, then while you're building up a buffer, at least you have something that you could turn to in an emergency. But when I think about that poem idea and what was important, what we've learned over the last year is the value of stuff and the things that are important to people. And if you combine that with the idea of like, well, if you had a box and you had to put in, what is it that is really important to people now? Is it really those frivolous consumer things, whatever it is, in terms of maybe it's clothes, flashy cars? We've started to learn to live without a lot of that stuff. And we've actually probably learned a lot about ourselves in the last year of what we do value and what we don't value and what we do need and what we don't need. And actually we've been able to rein in our finances. If I speak for myself personally, my finances this year are different to last year because they are so much more frugal, not in the case of living on baked beans or anything crazy like that, but chipping away the things I didn't need. Don't need gym memberships. I can do it at home. Even when the gym was back up, I didn't go back to the gym. I continued doing the stuff at home. So you start realizing what's important, and it's about those things that you value in life, but combine it with the new year thought process where you're projecting this forward. What is it you want out of life? And one of the biggest things in the FI movement, which is quite interesting, is about writing down a mission statement that increases your chances of success. So what I mean with this is if you really want to achieve a particular thing, it may be that you want to change jobs or you want to be able to retire by a certain age, but not even the whole give up work retirement. It might be that you want to perhaps go on a certain holiday or visit somewhere, whatever it is, you need to write that down. It may be you want to run your own business. It may be that you want to leave your current job to be able to start running a business that related to a passion. But if you write it down and become very deliberate, almost like a resolution, but combine it with what you've learned over the last year about how you could be frugal, what you do and don't need, cut out the wastage, what you will start to realize that being happy isn't a direct correlation with money. What it actually is that money helps you to have that ability to make choices. So that choice, that freedom, isn't about how much you have, it's how much you need. So it starts working around to what the whole point of this piece is you also work out what is enough. And now there's a really good quote that was attributed to John Bogle, of all people, the founder of the Vanguard Group. And he gave a speech back in 2007 to Georgetown University. And he told a story of how he recalled a party by a billionaire on Shelter Island. And it was Kurt Vonnegut. I've probably said his name wrong or mispronounced it. He was a American author, and he was talking to Joseph Heller, who was also an American author. Actually, he wrote Catch-22, and he made a comment between the two that was that their host, who was a hedge fund manager, has probably made more money in a single day than Heller had earned from his popular Catch-22 novel in its whole history. And Heller responded, "Yes, but I have something he will never have." And the answer was enough. And that sort of profound statement is what I want people to ponder. What is enough? Everybody has an enough figure. And that could be the amount of money they need to live, like people say, financially independent, retire early. But it might be just, what is enough? If I really had to cut everything back, I lost my job because of the pandemic, or I wanted to change jobs because I'm so unhappy. What's the minimum amount of money that I need to do that? But projecting forward, if my new life, this mission statement I'm going on, what I want to do in life, what is it that I need to achieve that? What is enough? At what point will I be happy where I don't have to be on this constant wheel of trying to make more money? At what point is enough? And so what I want people to do is think about what is enough in terms of minimum expenditure and in terms of a fund that will achieve what they want. Think about what is it you want in life? What sort of house do you want? Where do you want to live? All these things. And I think what's happened is the coronavirus and the pandemic has actually given each of us far more insight into that question and ourselves. So I just want people to take that opportunity as we're in the new year and actually reflect on all of that. And one other thing is that I've also heard the term a F-off fund. So obviously F being that rather naughty word, but the idea that if you had a boss you didn't like, how much money would you need to be sufficient for you to be able to go, do you know what, screw this, quit your job and then go somewhere else or try and do something else. Not that it will actually replace all your wages, but enough just to keep you going so you'll be able to take some risk if you wanted to do that. So work out what that is. Work out what that amount of money is. It won't necessarily be as much as you think it is. It's just got to probably keep you going for a period of time and paying those minimum expenses.
Okay, that moves us on to the last piece, and it's something about good enough is good enough.
Yeah, and I've been very philosophical this week. That's what happens when I take time off work and ponder things. And one of the things I talk about on the podcast often is the idea that good enough is good enough. And it's good for your mental health to think like that. So sometimes in life you explain these things and then you obviously hear another version of somebody come along and say something very similar, but they articulate it in a different way that you think, well, that will probably resonate with people who listen to the podcast as well. So obviously we talk about the MOT as we did last week, the money MOT that will help you sort your finances. But even within that, I don't go on about a perfection, a perfect plan. It's trying to just improve from where you were. And one of the things about good enough is good enough is the key thing is getting people moving. So the whole idea of a 1,000-mile journey starts with a single step. Once you start going, then you're more likely to continue with a journey and actually make a change. Now, there's an interesting book that came out at the back end of last year called The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. And while I read the book, I don't agree with everything that's necessarily in there, but there was quite an interesting point that he made within that, which was about reasonable versus rational. And the idea is that anything you do should be reasonable. And by that I mean is that obviously with money, there are rational things to do. So let's take an example that he actually uses in his book, which is the idea that somebody who is very young could, perhaps some people could argue, should leverage up their investing. So basically they end up borrowing money to amplify their returns. The problem is it also amplifies their losses. And there was some research done and modelling that showed that over time how much more money you would make, and by the time you retired how wealthy you could be. The problem is that along the way you would be wiped out several times when the market collapsed, because obviously if you leverage up you're going to amplify the losses, so you can actually lose everything, almost have to start again. The problem with any plan that is purely rational is that you forget the fact that we are human beings and we are emotional. And so if you wiped out and lost all your money, then the chances are you would quit. You wouldn't go, right, okay, back on the horse, I'm going to carry on. Equally, we fear losses more than we do gain. So therefore, the idea, what I mean by that is that if you were to gain 10%, the feelings we have over gaining 10% versus losing 10% are far more amplified in the case of losing 10%. We're more concerned with losing it than the idea of what will happen on the upside. That makes sense. You should be similar. You should sit there and think we should feel about both in the same way, but we don't. We fear losses to a far greater extent. And so what it means is that if you had a perfectly rational plan in the example I just gave, that those losses would hurt more. And so people would therefore probably stop. And it therefore means that people are less likely to be successful in anything they do. So if we take that and we apply it to other areas of personal finance, then it means that if you have a rational plan, then it can mean that having a reasonable plan is adequate, because it means you're more likely to continue with the plan and therefore achieve some kind of success. So I'll give you another example. The odds of you making money on a given day in the stock market is about 50-50. It either goes up or it goes down. Over the next 20 years, say for example, we took a 20-year period, if you look back at history, it's 100% certainty pretty much that your money will be worth more in 20 years' time than it is today if you invest it. Now, if somebody had a plan that was perfectly rational, that might mean along the way that they would maybe incur losses and they don't stick to the plan because they're having some completely wild investment strategy that will make them rich in the long run, supposedly, but it's going to be very uncomfortable. So as a human, they're likely to stop. Then that plan, is it a good plan, even if it's rational? Well, the answer would probably be no, because they'd end up quitting, because they're humans, they're emotional. Whereas if they had a reasonable plan that might be very boring, they just perhaps invest in a low risk stuff and a steady way, nothing too crazy. What it would mean is they would steadily go along, a bit like the tortoise, but they would eventually get there. And the fact that over 20 years, you're almost certainly going to end up benefiting from being invested in the stock market, the fact that you are still there in 20 years' time because your plan was reasonable, i.e. it had flaws, it wasn't perfect, you weren't optimizing everything in what you were doing, but it was good enough for you, that kept you going because the kind of person you are, that you are happy with just doing it, this is enough for me, then you will benefit from that fact that after 20 years that the stock market generally will always go up. And so you can argue sometimes that reasonable is better than rational for a lot of people. And so this goes back to the idea when I say good enough is good enough. If you have an investment plan or investment process, if it works for you and you're happy with it, then that's the main thing. It doesn't matter that somebody down the road or somebody at the golf course has got some other crazy investment thing that their financial advisors told them about, whether it would be investing in films or fine art, that they're making apparently loads of money, then that doesn't matter. It's about what's reasonable for you. And it again can apply to when it comes to perhaps clearing debt or dealing with other areas of your finance. Whatever increases the chance of success, and sometimes it will be something that is just reasonable more than it is rational, then that is also a positive, because it means you're more likely to succeed. Now, one thing he doesn't touch upon in the book, which I thought was slightly odd, is when does reasonable become irrational? So you've got a rational plan that says this is the best thing you should be doing now with your money. You should be putting this amount away in this particular maybe it was a investment index, whatever it is, or taxation wise, you should be doing this. That's rational, but you do another plan that is reasonable. But at what point does it become irrational? And actually, this all falls apart. And I would argue that it falls apart when the reasonable plan has not been based upon a rational idea or process. It didn't start there. So you got what I mean? It's like if you're making a recipe and you're trying to make a cake, My daughter's forever changing recipes. I love the fact that she does. It doesn't always end up with the nicest cake, I admit, but she will change it and it's being creative. But at the end of the day, a cake comes out the other end and it's a success. It's a cake. And that's the idea, that she starts with something. If I just said to her, go and bake a cake randomly without following a recipe, then I don't know what would come back. But the idea that it starts with something that's completely rational, that then ends up being something that's being reasonable, i.e. she changed it to something that suits her, means that the chances that the cake's going to actually rise and be something bordering on a cake that people like is increased. So that is the idea. Don't be worried about imperfection. Money is idiosyncratic. So therefore, solutions to things, I believe, should also reflect the fact that money is idiosyncratic. There you go. So we are done for this week, Andy. I hope I've blown people's brains. I've given people a lot to think about this week. And hopefully, going forward into 2021, they will take action.
I don't think you've blown people's brains. I think you've given people a lot of food for thought, and there's a difference in that. Brilliant stuff. So we're done this week. And if you want to get in touch with Damien, you can do so. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's at moneytothemasses with the number 2. And of course, we're on Instagram and Facebook. Don't forget to join our Facebook group if you haven't. We've got a lot of new listeners in the new year. It always happens. You may not know that we have a community group for like-minded people who want to learn tips and tricks about money. Maybe they want to share knowledge they already have. Maybe they want the knowledge of others for themselves. So go along to facebook.com/groups/money to the masses and click on the group there. We'll let you in. You just need to tick a couple of things to accept the rules of the group, and in you come. And it'll be great because what you can do in there is you can ask questions of other people. You can even give us suggestions for things you'd like us to cover on the podcast. We like that too. Damien, we're done, aren't we, for this week?
We're done. And as ever, we always leave it to the last minute when we should do it at the beginning of the podcast, like other podcasts do. Leave us a review. I mean, we've not had a review. Actually, I think people took a time off over Christmas, didn't leave reviews. Let's make me and Andy happy and leave us a review, because we do read them all, and we do obviously occasionally read them out. So until next time.
Until next time.